Welcome to the Ripcord Moment. I'm your host, Joe Seetoo. Today we're joined by Julia Schieffer. She's the editor and founder of DerivSource. It's a digital publication magazine that covers OTC derivatives, both for pre- and post-trade operations, technology, fintech, risk management, etc. And Markets Media Group acquired her company in 2021. She's worked in the publishing arena as a consultant, both for DerivSource and wider business strategies for quite some time. Prior to starting her company over a decade ago, she actually wrote for multiple trade publications, both in the United States and in the UK, as a freelance journalist, and was a managing editor of Operations Management. Now, this was a publication for institutional investor news and Euromoney PC. She's also a board member of Women in Listed Derivatives, WILD Group, a nonprofit for women, both in London, starting in 2001 up until 2021. Julia, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited about our discussion today.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
Well, you have a really interesting background. What got you, tell me a little bit more about your business and why you started your company.
Well, I think you summarized DerivSource quite well. Just to give a little bit more information. So DerivSource is, as you said, an online community and information source for OTC derivatives professionals globally. And so, as you pointed out, we cover risk, regulation, technology, and we also cover crypto derivatives, all the new trends, ESG derivatives, the technology that is underpinning some of the innovation in the space. And also in the past, we've touched on professional development. And so that's D&I, that's looking at job trends, hybrid working, and we really try to look at our audience members holistically. So sometimes that includes some professional development in addition to the topics and trends that we would cover.
So you're bringing a professional development into something as technical and esoteric as derivatives. That covers quite a spectrum for your audience.
Our audience is very specific. It's very segmented. So I think when you go narrow and deep and you're very focused on something, for us, OTC derivatives and post-trade downwards, we're not speaking to the entire institutional finance space. So you can really focus holistically on that individual because they have a very unique working experience compared to other financial professionals.
No, I love the fact that you're going so deep in such a specific industry. What really drew you to the space?
Well, the reason why I started DerivSource was really born out of an idea. And that idea was back when I was working as a journalist, I really noticed a gap in the market. And that gap in the market is kind of in line with what I just said. A lot of the B2B trade publications covering finance in this space at that time, they were covering all of capital markets, but they weren't covering operations too much except for covering securities operations, which is much more automated than the manual processing, especially when I started, which OTC derivatives face, very paper contract based.
Okay.
So what happened really, Joe, is that as a youngin', I had this idea and I just wanted to pursue it. And it changed rather quickly because of the credit crisis. So I launched this idea. It was a blog idea. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
I can really focus on what I know. I already have the audience in my Rolodex. But then the credit crisis happened. And of course, you'll recall, very chaotic, confusing time.
Absolutely. Sure. The world was changing, right? Yeah.
Very rapidly. And we all kind of didn't know what was going on. Well, this is more amplified for my particular segment because they work in OTC derivatives, and all of a sudden derivatives are all over the news, right?
Sure.
So suddenly everyone knows about derivatives.
Yeah.
And so what that meant for me is I had to pivot quite early on from a blog, essentially, to a community. So I really focused on building a community, building trust amongst this segment, where I created an online portal, an information source for them to get information, but also to connect with each other.
Well, maybe we can pivot to you as the owner, right? At that time, what were some of the challenges you faced in such a chaotic time as the business owner operator?
At that time, I don't know if it was necessarily so much challenges at that time. It was more challenges that I had due to my age, because I was in this business in my 20s.
Wow.
And so being young, I had to learn quite early on the challenges of being a small business owner-operator, particularly in this space. And so I had to learn to pivot quite quickly. I already described, I had to move to more of a community, building trust with people, rather than thinking it was just a blog. So I always give people this analogy of shipping, which I know nothing about, by the way. But I really viewed myself as a small speedboat. And I'm, in a vast ocean, choppy waters, market conditions changing, weather conditions changing. And I have this huge ship liner next to me. That's my competition.
Right.
And then I'm getting the waves off of this huge ship liner. And so it was a very scary time for me because I have this great idea. I truly believed in it. I was passionate about it, but I know nothing about running a business. And so I learned early on that I needed to pivot away from the waves, the risks, but I also could pivot towards the opportunities much faster than these other businesses who sure had the resources, the girth, and they knew where they were going, which is always necessarily an advantage. I could pivot. And so for me, one of the experiences that really colored the early years was being experimental and being an early adopter in new technology. And I can give you an example if you like.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear. I mean, just to recap, though, it sounds like you're saying in being nimble, using your size to your advantage, while it not necessarily looking at it as a disadvantage, but rather an advantage. But yeah, I'd love to hear a specific story.
So one of the things that I would give an example of is webinars. So back when I started, it was prior pandemic, obviously. Webinars were new. They were not brand new, but they were newish technology, particularly for my segment and my space. And so very early on, within about a year of starting the business, I recognized that I really need to focus on this technology because it was a mode to get people together, actually on like a Zoom call, on a webinar. So we had that connection, we had that community, and we could share different ideas, because a lot of the information that we needed was not necessarily clarified. So it was these online meetings and sessions with sometimes up to 1,000 people.
Oh,
and so we had sometimes small webinars, very specific, some huge. But my point is that a lot of people said I was crazy. A lot of people said, don't do webinar, you got to do physical events. Everybody wants to meet in person. Everybody wants to have lunch. But I didn't have the experience in running events. And I didn't have the resources to run a huge conference. So I did it digitally, and it worked.
So let's take that, because one of the things that we shared in our prior discussions that, your ability to overcome challenges, some of these speak to sort of who you are as an individual, I think. And talk to our audience a little bit about the qualities that an entrepreneur needs to have, grit, things like that define who you are and how you've been able to harness those characteristics to help you push through some of the challenges you had to overcome.
Good question. I think the one thing that really comes to mind is in line with kind of what I've already said. And so I think for me early on, I was really driven by this idea, by this passion. And so, but I had so much to learn because I was in my 20s, and grit is a great word, Joe. But basically I had to persevere. I had this idea, and despite the fact that, I had to work very hard to be seen. I didn't look like a typical founder, CEO in this space.
Sure.
I was new. I didn't have the established network. I'm a journalist straddling business owner, publisher, all these new roles. And it took a lot to get in front of people, get in their diaries, get in their calendars, have meetings. And so I would say for me, I had to persevere and gain that confidence quite early on, and also take the hits. You get rejected a lot. And so I would have little tools around me that would help me keep on track.
What are some of those tools? I love this.
So one of the biggest challenges for me in general, but also as an owner operator, is I get distracted. And I try to do everything. Right?
Yep.
Especially
too many plates at once.
Too many plates at once. And I think when you're an owner operator, and so many people listening will understand this, if you're a parent, if you're an owner operator, if you just have a huge team, the plate spinning can be a lot to handle in terms of mental load. And so I had two things that I did that were tools. And what they really did is they helped me from getting distracted and also pulled away from my mission, my goal. And I had a Post-it note, a green, bright Post-it note that I had on my screen every day with my mission. And if I ever had a client request or somebody say, you should do this, I would sit back and look at this and go, do I need to do this? Is this in line with the values? Is this in line with what I'm aiming to do? Because sometimes it is and sometimes it's not.
And saying no, oftentimes, I think what we find with people who become successful, they say yes to so many things, and it opens up so many opportunities, and that gets them to a certain level. But then the problem becomes that asset becomes one of their weaknesses, where then all of a sudden they're piling on more and more. I think I haven't read it, but people will tell me to read it all the time. What got you here won't get you where you want to go next, right? There's a book on it. And saying no at a certain point actually is something we have to embrace. And it's not always an easy thing to do.
Yeah. And I would say I definitely had that. And one of the things that I had to do that's very similar to what you just said is I had to learn to be okay with failures.
Mm-hmm. When you say okay with failures, what do you mean by that?
Well, my originally, like early on, I was experimenting a lot and I was doing exactly what you said. I was just trying everything and I wasn't doing it in a strategic, systematic way. So I started to having this Post-it note to say, does this, because sometimes you get requests from clients that are not in line with your business. You can't do everything for everybody, right?
Sure, no.
So I kept in line looking at the Post-it note, what mine focused on. I also had testimonials. So I felt good if I had a bad day, someone would say, and send me an email, I would review that. And that would, keep me on track. But with the failures, everybody has failures, right?
Yeah, it's part of life. If you're growing, if you're looking to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. So I reframed failures as experiments. And so I told myself every year I'm going to do 2 new things. So one of the things that I learned quite early on was that I wanted to do at least 2 experiments a year, try something new. And so that allowed me to be strategic about it rather than, taking on different impacts or different inputs rather. So one of the things that I did early on, which bear with me again, this is very...
No, that's okay. I love this story.
Yeah. You might have actually experienced this, but basically easing. So going back a while, my industry was very much focused on print publications when I first started. I was one of the very first to be 100% digital. Okay. And so I had this idea, easings, they're basically PDF on your screen and they have the technology that actually you can hear the pages turning, which I thought was quite cool. And so it was this hybrid medium between print and the digital. I thought, great. So I started playing around with it and launching these easings on particular topics. My last easing was in 2014 on Bitcoin derivatives. And it didn't succeed. I thought people would love it. They didn't love the easings. Yeah. I thought Bitcoin derivatives, but I was obviously 6 or 7 years too early.
You're just too early. That's all it was.
Yeah. But I had to take the financial hit, and I had to take this idea that I really thought was going to work and just realize it doesn't.
But that's the life of an entrepreneur, right? And so you've obviously been able to, well, actually, I want to pivot back real quick. What was on the sticky note? I have to know. What did your green sticky note say?
Inform, educate, and connect.
Okay, so that was your mission and your core values. And if those requests didn't align with that, it was probably easier to give yourself permission to say no, to stay focused on really what the mission was of your business, of who you were and what you wanted to create. And I think what you bring up is a critical point, because so oftentimes I run into owners who they keep it all in their head and they don't memorialize some of these things that you hear about in business school and that you talk about, right, which are like missions and core values and what the company really stands for. And if owners don't take the time to get that down and document it and then distribute it to their client, to their teammates, to their partners, to the employees, very easily, right, the business is running in so many different directions, and ultimately then you end up with a real big failure, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the better businesses will know that it comes down to authenticity too. If you're trying to be everything for everybody, every client, whether that's you individually as a professional or your business and the reputation that business has, that's never going to succeed. People want to know what you stand for. And not that it's necessarily some grandiose goal or mission, but you need to be clear with what you want your business to be doing for people. What is its purpose?
Yeah, well, there's clear lines in the sand of who you are as a company, who you are in terms of what the clientele that you serve, what services you provide. Maybe we could pivot a little bit to your Ripcord moment, your exit. What allowed for that sort of shift in mindset that I'm ready to have some sort of succession event? What did that look like?
Well, there wasn't an aha moment for me.
Okay.
I didn't have one particular aha moment.
No big light bulb just went off, huh?
No, because I'm truly passionate about what I do and I enjoyed it. But there were two mind shift changes, I'll say, that were contributing factors. So one was after the birth of my first child, I took temporary leave and I passed the business on to very capable hands, and it worked. Whatever I had set up worked well. It thrived, and I realized that I could take a step back and not spin every plate, not hold every single rein. I could let go a little bit, and the business did quite well. So that was number one.
I want to go deeper real quick on that, because you strike me as a very capable individual, very methodical and detail oriented. And so a lot of us who are wired that way, the notion of letting go is kind of scary. And so you talk about mindset shift. What was it that allowed you to move towards a mindset shift that allowed you to let go? Was it really the catalyst of having your child that ultimately helped you get to that point?
That was a contributing factor, but it definitely was not the sole factor. You're absolutely right. It was more of a kind of slow realization and evolution that led me to this path. And my second kind of factor is kind of answering your question. And what it was is that I really saw that the business growth and my personal growth, because I mean, one of the whole reasons why I stuck with running a business despite all its challenges and headaches and stress is because I was gaining so much as an individual, learning new skills. I was so scared of public speaking, and I had to learn that as a skill that was integral to my business's success. Yeah. And so when I started to realize that there was a time when I wasn't growing as fast as I had been, and the business growth could be greater if I wasn't holding all the reins, that was the biggest mind shift change, where I was like, okay, maybe it's time for me to pass the baton to another company that has the resources and has the talent and has the vision for where DerivSource can grow, and hopefully allows me more opportunities to grow individually as well.
I mean, I love that you had that much self-awareness to realize that that your growth was going sort of in a different direction, or wasn't at the same pace where it previously was, that the rhythm had changed, and that, I mean, when a business is able to really separate itself from the owner and its growth trajectory is on a different, it needs different skill sets to continue to evolve it and take it to the next level. That's really admirable that you were able to recognize that, and not, because so many owners, oftentimes what they do is they can't make that detachment, and they ultimately suffocate or kill the business, right? It ends up pivoting over from its arc on growth and going downhill, and you were actually able to transition it to another owner, allowed to continue to get to even a higher level. That's beautiful. I mean, I love that.
I think that's a good challenge to point out, though, because it's not that I didn't struggle with it. It's my baby. It's my first baby. Absolutely. I was very attached to it. I still am. I'm still, working with Markets Media on various different roles, including running DerivSource. But one of the things that might help other people listening out there, that at least helped me, was I knew where I had retained that value from my time, and I could reflect on that and understand that that value would carry me forward as well. And so that sounds like a wishy-washy way, but I'll give you an example. So one of the realizations that I had was, and going back to the challenges, I didn't have a ready-made network, because often you get your network within the four walls of the institution you're working at, and then, other networks and all that. I had to craft my own network through I just had to do it myself through the Women Enlisted Derivatives group and through my own nurturing of relationships. So one of the things that really kept me going afterwards was realizing that all these things I had done, this network, or now friends, that you meet for lunch and you have drinks with, and your women's groups and that sort of thing, that helped with the business, but that also gave me a better foundation to grow into other ways that is outside of my business. So you start to kind of separate yourself and the experiences that you had in that business. It's almost, I would imagine, when your kids go to college, right?
I would think so, yeah. Well, there's so many analogies that you get that I run into in the exit planning world that are likening the business to the baby and allowing it to grow. And so I think you're spot on. And so, I call this the Ripcord Moment because I believe when an owner goes to sell their business, transition, it's some sort of succession event. It's like jumping out of a plane. And so many owners don't have their parachute packed. That ripcord better not fail if they really want to have the kind of landing that they deserve. And so I always ask our guests for 2 bold action items that they would impart to other owners to think about doing sooner than later. What would those 2 action items be if you could impart some advice?
Well, I would say the 2 things that I would say, one is, and this works for me. I would say the 2 things that what I would recommend are, one is know your worth and know what you really want, not what you think you should want, what you really want. Write that down on a piece of paper or wherever on your phone or something. Keep it there and don't waver from it. And this might just be 2 things, because ultimately, if you're a business owner operator in particular, the business has to continue to work for you and vice versa. I truly believe that. Otherwise, you're not enjoying yourself.
Okay.
Second thing I would say is get a good lawyer, team, agent, whatever you're using.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
And get someone who you trust and who knows your list and will make you accountable for sticking with what you truly want.
I'm going to recap what you said because I think those are 2 great pearls of wisdom. One is taking the time to be authentic to and taking the time to envision your life after the business, because I find oftentimes owners don't take the time to do that. They may go through the financial planning that we put them through. They may even hire a CPA or a lawyer, but a lot of them don't take the time to do the self-reflection like you're talking about. Those that do, I find, tend to have more successful transactions psychologically and emotionally. So I'm 100% on board with you. And yes, building a transition team, which is what we do at Morton and support our clients in doing for succession plan. Yeah, no one person can really do this alone and I think have an optimal outcome.
Yeah, and you wouldn't want to do it alone.
No.
You need people to bounce. Absolutely, you need people to bounce ideas off. And I would give one more piece of advice.
Yeah.
I think your analogy is great for the ripcord. You need to be prepared before you even get on that plane.
Yeah.
But I would also say for small business owners in particular, or someone who's new to a space, is a ripcord moment might not necessarily be an exit. It might be, I'm going to take a year off to do a PhD or go traveling or whatever.
Sure.
And so if you, like what you've just said, if you had that opportunity to reflect and you really stick to making the business work for you and all those inevitables, then it doesn't matter the ripcord moment. You just have to make sure you land where you want to land.
No, you're 100% on.
You're happy, right?
Yeah, you have more control of your destiny when you make that jump. You're not being pushed out of the plane.
Yep,
So,
but you have to be prepared, right?
you have to be prepared. Well, Julia, if anyone in the audience wants to get a hold of you, what would be the best way for them maybe to connect with you?
Oh, LinkedIn, for sure.
LinkedIn. Okay. Well, Julia Schieffer on LinkedIn. And Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today to share your story. I really enjoyed our conversation. This is Joe Seetoo from the Ripcord Moment. We're going to go ahead and sign off, and we will catch you next time.